You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in this episode, we will not just discuss the magical works of Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, or the mediocre works of everyone else. We will also offer a public service announcement. You may actually have been mispronouncing the name of their studio your entire life. And if you have, the real pronunciation may come as a complete and utter shock. It is, in fact, not pronounced Studio Ghibli, but Studio Ghibli. That's right, Ghibli. And while some of you may still be cradling in a fetal position on the floor, let's dive into the greatest studio in anime history. It will be absolutely impossible, though, to do justice to all of Studio Ghibli's 20 films in just one episode. We have therefore chosen to focus in on the two driving creative forces of the studio, Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, and examine Studio Ghibli through the lens of their first and last double features. That is to say, the double feature of 1988, which in so many ways kickstarted the Studio Ghibli we know today, My Neighbour Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies. And the studio's, at least at that time, proposed swansongs of 2013, The Wind Rises and The Tale of Princess Kaguya. We will look at how these films contrast each other and tell a story of Studio Ghibli's emotional and artistic power. We will also look at how Miyazaki and Takahata developed their style over this 25-year period, and the rise, and if not a complete fall, decline of Studio Ghibli, with no promising heir apparent in sight. As usual, I'm joined by two wonderful co-hosts, Saul and Mathieu, and let's just jump right into this, guys. What is your very first memory of Studio Ghibli? What is the first film you saw from them, and what was your general experience?
Hi, I'm Mathieu. The first Ghibli film I watched, and I'm going to pronounce it Ghibli because I thought it was Ghibli actually in Japanese, but I'm not going to try that, so I'm just going to stick with Ghibli. So I think the first film I watched was Castle in the Sky, and I remember really liking it. But really, there were 4 films that I discovered when I was like 11 or 12. And so it was Castle in the Sky, Princess Mononoke, Spirited Away, and Howl's Moving Castle. And the one that really affected me at the time was Princess Mononoke, to the point that when I started being on the internet, I started using avatars from Princess Mononoke, and I still do to this day. So Castle in the Sky was my first, but Princess Mononoke was kind of the formative one.
Hi, it's Sol from Australia. I'm going to continue to pronounce it Studio Ghibli because I'm not sure about the proper pronunciation, and I'm sure if Miyazaki was listening to our podcast, he would be happy enough we're discussing his films, even if we can't pronounce the names correctly. So the first Studio Ghibli film that I saw was Spirited Away. I actually saw it in 2002 during its theatrical run in Australia. I was really blown away by it at the time. I would have been maybe 15 years old, and I hadn't seen much in the way of anime or animated films beyond what had come out of America. So it was really something quite different to me, and it was a very striking film, Spirited Away, because there's basically no bad guys in it. They're just sort of like misguided individuals. So very different from your average sort of Hollywood film. And what was really great about Spirited Away is that after it won the Oscar and got all this buzz and everything, a couple of years later, all of Miyazaki's other films started getting shown on TV in Australia. So over the next couple of years after 2002, I would have gone through most of his filmography up until that point.
Yeah, my first experience with Studio Ghibli was also Spirited Away. I think at that point I had exactly the same impression of animated films as you saw. It just my association was with Disney, which I have a much better impression of now as well. But at the time I always saw them as slightly more towards children, and I guess not as poetical as the works of Miyazaki and Takahata can get. And Spirited Away just blew me away because it took you into this massive world. And the moment I saw it, on the recommendation of so many other people around me, which just couldn't believe I hadn't seen Spirited Away yet. This was just a few years after it had come out. I started also going through all of the available films. It was just such an amazing discovery. That does lead me over to my next question, though, which is how your impression has changed. Because, at least for me, when I first started watching these films, it was Miyazaki that really won me over. I just loved his type of wonder and adventure. But lately, especially as I have been watching many of these films ahead of this podcast, it is really Takahata that is standing out to me with his even experimentation at times and the way he really dares to be different. So has your opinion of Studio Ghibli or the films that speak to you changed since you first discovered them?
Well, in some cases, my opinion has changed a bit, but for the most part, I'm just really a huge fan of Studio Ghibli as a whole. Even their lesser films, I kind of enjoy them anyway because I just enjoy the style and the mood of it. But certainly, yes, as with, I think, most people, I started with Miyazaki, as I mentioned earlier, and then discovering Takahata. And like you said, Takahata, he makes films that are just as great as Miyazaki, and he makes them in such different styles. I mean, he's a fascinating artist. I would still prefer Miyazaki's films overall, but I think Takahata is amazing, and discovering Takahata was somewhat of a revelation for me also much later, because the 4 Ghibli films I mentioned were really all I watched for when I was a kid. It was what we had on DVD, and I didn't watch anything else. So all the other films I saw as an adult.
So looking at how Studio Ghibli's changed for me over the years, I did start off by generally liking them a lot, and like Matthew and Chris has said, expanding out to Takahata, who's actually, I think, a more consistent director overall. I generally have higher ratings for all of his films compared to Miyazaki, who's got a few hit and misses in there. But looking at Studio Ghibli as a whole, I actually checked up before the podcast and I've seen all of their films except for Ocean Waves. Coming to them and I guess seeing them over the years, my opinion has changed a little bit. As I said before, after the success of Spirited Away, you had all the other Miyazaki films coming out on Australian TV, or Howl's Moving Castle in 2005, I think, when it came out on DVD, and that really impressed me. I'd say really after that point, for me, the studio became incredibly uneven. I do like Ponyo a lot. I think it's a really good film. But I'd say after Howl's Moving Castle, I'd say the subsequent films don't have quite the same magic for me as the earlier films of Studio Ghibli do.
That's a big claim, Saul. I think I agree on the majority of them, but I do think that the last double feature, The Wind Rises and Princess Kaguya, those are just so wonderful films to me that they would rank with their very, very best work.
It is a generalization, and I do like Takahata's Princess film. I'm going to pronounce the name incorrectly, so I'm not going to try. I think it's a good film and well animated, but compared to his other films, it's a weaker one for him. And yeah, other than the Princess film and Ponyo, I'd say all the other films post Howl's Moving Castle were disappointments to me, but I'm sure we'll discuss that later on the podcast.
We will, but I think it in some ways has also to do with more films not by Miyazaki and Takahata, which I think is generally the problem with Ghibli.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that also, and yeah, I'm sure we'll get to that also.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think we can all pretty much agree, as I also said in my opening, that the work by essentially all of the other directors associated with Studio Ghibli, except perhaps Konto, who died after just one film, Whispers of the Heart, they just don't really stand as tall as the films by Miyazaki and Takahata. But just before we really dive into the origins of Ghibli and My Neighbour Totoro and The Way of the Fireflies, let's just ask a really quick question. Is Ghibli the be-all, end-all of anime?
Well, I guess I would definitely say no to that, even though to me they're on their own planets. When I think of anime, I don't think of Ghibli. I think of, Evangelion and Akira and stuff like that. And to me, Ghibli, even though technically it's anime because that's just how the Japanese call animation, but it's stylistically quite different, right, from what we think of as generally Japanese animation. So it's a be-all, end-all in the sense that it's definitely what I love the most. But I think there's plenty else to explore in Japanese animation that's interesting, but that's not really that related to Ghibli, except for a few recent authors like Mamoru Hosoda. I guess it depends how you define be-all, end-all.
Likewise, I wouldn't like to term them as the be-all and end-all. I'd say there have definitely been a lot of really great anime films out there. Films like Your Name, I thought that was excellent. There was an interesting recent one from Netflix called A Whisker Away, which isn't a perfect film, but still quite interesting. There's a lot out there with anime, but I think in terms of novice film goers, we put it that way, or people who are just getting into anime, I think it's always probably going to be the starting point. The brand is just that iconic, but no, I don't think it's the end point, not by any stretch.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And obviously you had Oshii and Otoma with Akira, for instance, coming out at the same time as the early Ghibli films. And especially during their decline in the late zeros, you still had Satoshi Kon, even though he died early, and you still had Shinkai and Osuda, etc., and several other really great anime directors working, which at that time were matching or even doing better work than the late Studio Ghibli films. So definitely not the be-all, end-all, even though they probably have made the majority of my favorite anime films. But it's interesting, though, the contrast that Mathieu shows to strike between anime in the sense of Evangelion and what Studio Ghibli makes. Because it is true to an extent that the artistic style and choices of the studio differ so much from the often action-driven, more, I'm not going to say juvenile, but more child-friendly work to the more slow, composed, contemplative works that Studio Ghibli puts out. I mean, if you look at My Neighbour Totoro, for instance, yes, you have magical beings in it and there's so much wonder, but they're probably not on screen for more than 10-15 minutes. The majority of the rest is just this quiet, serene tale of two girls in 1950s, 1960s Japan missing their mother. So I think that they are providing something that you didn't really see that often in the anime world. But what is really interesting, though, is that that is the world that both Miyazaki and Takahata came from. I mean, they both worked on so many of the television shows in 60s and 70s Japan. If you go back to Takahata's very debut, Hono, which was about a little bit of Norse mythology and just this boy with some magical abilities, you can't really tell the difference from that and the other work. And similarly with Miyazaki's debut in 1979, I believe, which is the Lupin 3 film, that's just tying into the show that he and Takahata worked on. So they really came from that world. And that's also why I think they founded Studio Ghibli, because they have been trying to make Totoro for such a long time. I mean, Miyazaki had been pitching it all across the 80s and just get rejected time and time again until he finally decided, like, we need to put together a studio. And I think it's just wonderful that they were actually able to do it and that they were able to fulfill their vision in that way, and they were able to find an audience for it, because that's what the bigger studios at the time didn't think they would be able to get. They didn't think that something like Totoro could attract anyone.
Yes, I think the way I think about anime, maybe as opposed to Ghibli, is I don't really think of Satoshi Kon as being anime either. I guess I think of anime as kind of the studio animation and maybe the rest of being more independent animation. I don't know if that really corresponds to how the term is used, but definitely, as you said, Miyazaki and Takahata certainly started at anime and then only did their thing when they had their own studio. And I think it's kind of true for other authors as well.
I think it's also interesting to note that in the early days, it was actually Takahata that was the biggest director, with Miyazaki usually being his animator. Miyazaki was the animator on his first film, and he kept being his animator across a large amount of films that people just don't know or remember. Like, they both worked on a series of movies called the Heidi movies, which I haven't been able to find anywhere. And most of their work before Studio Ghibli is just completely ignored. In part, probably just because the quality jump is so big, there's very few stylistic similarities. But it is interesting, though, that these two really talented people worked for about 20 years before founding Studio Ghibli, and they worked on so many films and shows. And then from the realization that essentially none of what they did before is really remembered well, even though some of it is quite good.
So I haven't seen any pre-Ghibli Takahata, but The Castle of Cagliostro, the Lupin III film, it actually came out in theaters 3 years ago here. And it's quite good, and I think you can see elements of what Miyazaki would do later. I don't like it as much as most of his Ghibli work, but I think it's already quite strong. And from what I understand, you guys have seen some of Takahata's films and like them as well?
Yeah, I've seen Takahata's Panda films, Panda Go Panda, and Panda Rainy Day Circus. Lovely films. They feel more Miyazaki in tone than Takahata, because Takahata, I guess, always Grave of the Fireflies and Only Yesterday What Spring to Mind, and they're very light-hearted films, the Panda ones, but they're absolutely lovely, and it's a gorgeous relationship the little girl has with the panda. And I've also seen Gosho, the cellist, which is also a pretty interesting film. A lot of it about music, as you can guess, based on the title. And yeah, just nothing more than you would expect, I guess, if you just think of Grave of the Fireflies, when you think of Takahata, which I'm sure most people do.
Gosho the Cellist is such a surprising film. For a film from the 80s within the studio system, I mean, it's so quiet, it's so small and with elements of minimalism. It still has animals, it has some magical elements in it. But it still feels like he's trying to do something very, very different. And the next year, he also did Yarinko-chi, which is a film I really enjoy. It's quite funny, and it's actually quite similar to Only Yesterday and My Neighbor is the Yamadas, in that, it's taken from mangas and it's more of a serial setup where you have different situation with this little girl and her father, and it plays into these characters, and you're starting to really get immersed in their lives. It's not as great as those later films. There's a lot more blunt, a lot more direct in its humor, etc. But it's definitely also a good showing of what they will be able to do later.
And then I suppose we should mention that Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is technically pre-Ghibli, even though we think of it as being a Ghibli film now. But it was, what essentially enabled them to found the studio. And it feels like a Ghibli film, though.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, it really breathes like a Ghibli film. Like you have the soundscape, the world building, the exact same power of the animation style. It's just such a strong work. Though it's really interesting, though, that a part of the money from that film actually went into Takahata creating, I believe, an almost 3-hour documentary about the canals in Japan.
Wait, what? I didn't know that.
Oh, it's true. I haven't seen it yet. It's very hard to find, but if it ever becomes widely available, I would watch that right away.
Yeah, I agree about Nausicaa feeling much like a Ghibli film. And it was shown on TV down here at the same time they started showing Castle in the Sky and Porco Rosso and Kiki's Delivery Service. It felt like one and the same. It felt like that sort of film. Very strong ecological message in there, which is also something which you find throughout a lot of Miyazaki's works.
Yeah, one could argue that Princess Mononoke is kind of a remake of Nausicaa. It's very similar, really.
Okay, that's interesting. I never thought about that. I need to watch those two back to back at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think of them as being very similar, and one of them being sci-fi and the other being fantasy. But if you think of them together, I think you'd see there's some similarities.
That's such a good recommendation. I'll definitely try to do that.
That's interesting because I think when the Miyazaki films are shown on TV, they actually didn't show Princess Mononoke. I don't know why. They showed Nausicaa, they showed Castle in the Sky, they showed Porco Rosso, Kiki's Delivery Service. But they didn't show Princess Mononoke, I don't think. I didn't catch up until that one until a few years later.
Most likely because it's much, much more violent. Even Nausicaa, which has war, doesn't have arms going off, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, because they're marketing it on TV, like from the director of Spirited Away in like big letters. So they probably wanted to find films that were sort of like similar in tone.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we really should start diving into the double feature that in so many ways brought Ghibli to life, even though, of course, the very first Studio Ghibli film was Castle in the Sky, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about as well. But in 1988, and in part just because the expectations for Totoro were so low, shockingly, though it was originally a box office failure, they chose to release My Neighbor Totoro and Grave of the Fireflies at the same time. And this, it boggles the mind that they thought that this was a fitting double feature. You have one, which is just this largely bright and wonderful world of, wonder. And then you have one of the most depressing and heartbreaking anime films of just all time, in all of animation history, most likely. Both of them focusing on siblings, but in one, starting from the very beginning, knowing they will die these horrible, horrible deaths, and in the other one just feeling a kind of happiness. So it's just like I can't imagine what the audience would feel coming into these two films, and especially which order they would watch them in. So let me ask you then, like, which one do you want to talk about a little bit first here? Do you want to start with happiness or with sorrow and despair?
Well, actually, I'd like to talk about the aspect of the double feature, because I'm going to defend Ghibli a little bit here. I mean, I think commercially it makes zero sense to release them together because, as you said, they're very different tonally. But I do think of them as being reverse sides of the same coin, because I think they're both looking, in a way, at the innocence of childhood. You have Totoro, which is this very joyous film. It looks at childhood mostly positively, but it also has this underlying layer of sadness and scariness, right? The idea that when you're a child, you're not in control of anything. Stuff is going on over your head and you're vaguely aware of it, but it can be very scary. And that's what's happening with the mother's illness, right? And at some point it causes one of the children to really freak out. And so it's mostly extremely joyous, extremely celebrating the imagination and the innocence of childhood, but with that sadness underneath, with that scariness underneath. And I think Grave of the Fireflies is the exact reverse, right? It's a terrible situation. It's awful. It's extremely dramatic. But the whole point is that the older brother is trying to preserve that innocence of childhood in his sister. And in doing that, there are real moments of joy and beauty in Grave of the Fireflies that recall the similar moments in Totoro. It's just that it's those little moments inside a mostly very tragic story. And I think in a sense, Totoro is all about celebrating that innocence, but Grave of the Fireflies is where you go wrong when you try to stay in that innocence when the world around you just isn't adapted to that. And so I think they're actually a very fitting double feature artistically, if not commercially.
Yeah, I like what you've said, Matthew, about them being a fitting double feature. I'd probably agree with that, not just because they're about childhood, but they're also about childhood imagination in a way. So with the Totoro creatures, the girls see them and they're told like they're lucky to see spirits, and they sort of exist because we see them in their imagination, even though we don't know whether they really exist or not. There's a bit of a blur in there. It's all about the imagination. And then in Grave of the Fireflies, it's about trying to use that imagination, but in a more, let's say, adverse setting. So, starving for food and tries to get his sister to imagine that different things are bits of food. So both films for me are films about childhood imagination, but on different sides of the spectrums. What I remember most about both films, though, is just how striking they are animated. I just love the colors in Grave of the Fireflies. It's really striking. It's sort of like the film where you don't think if it was live action, they could actually get the colors quite as perfect as they do there. And with Totoro, there's just all these long distance shots where it actually could be live action because the bushes, the juice, the greenery all looks incredibly realistic. So they do make for a fitting combination.
No, I agree completely there. And that's also just a message to Japan and the world that this is what Studio Ghibli actually encompasses and the type that they can bring to life. And I think it's also interesting how different these two films are visually, which plays into the emotional spectrum as well, where you see Totoro with all of these fairly bright colors. You have this beautiful serenity, while in Grave of the Fireflies, the palette is a lot darker. You even have these scenes in almost complete red. But I also completely agree that even with these stylistic differences, Grave of the Fireflies really does manage to bring so much childlike wonder to life, and these scenes in between the horror are absolutely beautiful and lovely, and you see the bonding, and you see the happiness, and you see the hope. But of course, all of this is with the knowledge from that opening scene that they will both die, they will both end so terribly. So there's just this melancholy following all of this childlike wonder and all of this joy and imagination as well. That knowledge is always there, tainting the entire film.
Yeah, and I'd like to add regarding what Saul said about imagination, that it's definitely a connection. I absolutely agree, especially with the title of Grave of the Fireflies. I mean, the fireflies in question are the bombs. It's exactly that. It's exactly in a terrible situation, imagination letting you see something else. And then in Totoro, in a much quieter and easier situation, also that imagination taking over with the classic idea that only the children can see the imaginary creatures.
The one thing I really love about Totoro is the fact that Totoro, and not just King Totoro as is come to be known off screen later, but all of these creatures are shown so rarely, and that the magical elements, again, are shown so rarely that you have so much anticipation built up. Like you genuinely become excited when you see one of the Totoros, especially Totoro himself, if you will. Like the few moments when he is on screen, it's like everything brightens up. Everything really becomes magical. It really proves, at least to me, that just this holding back, not showing your key character, having these long build-ups can really, really work. Essentially, you feel the same sense of wonder when Totoro comes on screen as the children does.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely a wonderful sense in all the senses of the word. And it's also a film that grew on me. I think I would count it as my favorite Miyazaki or Ghibli film. But when I first saw it, I was 16 or 17, and I kind of dismissed it. I thought it was kind of a kiddie film, a film for children, and I liked it fine, but I was a little disappointed coming off Mononoke and Spirited Away. And when I watched it later as an adult, I kind of got it. I think it's a film that speaks to children and adults, but maybe not so much to teenagers.
And I think that is the way with so many Ghibli films. The way you see them will, in one way or another, change. I came into Totoro the first time from Spirited Away as well, and it was also a slight letdown then. Probably because if you look at Spirited Away, there's so much excess in how the spirits are shown. Like you really get to explore this world, while in Totoro, they're always at a distance. They're so rarely seen that it's like night and day. And it's like they've been spoiled by all of this other imagination that was to come later. But seeing it separately in its own context, like it is that anticipation that really makes it work. Then again, looking at it chronologically, it almost feels a little bit as well that Spirited Away is a kind of successor to Totoro, which just takes a completely different approach.
Yeah, Spirited Away is more of a fairy tale. I always saw it as kind of a Japanese version of Alice in Wonderland. And I think there's something also in that with Ponyo's version of The Little Mermaid. I think maybe it's something we can talk about is how there is a Western influence on Ghibli. People often talk about Ghibli as being this very specific cultural Japanese artifact. But I actually think that it's really a blend of Western influences with the Japanese kind of traditional lifestyle.
Oh, I think that's very, very clear. You're completely right, Matthew, especially in Miyazaki's films. A little bit less in Takahata's, I would argue. But you mentioned Alice in Wonderland. I think that's also a really interesting thing because so many people, me included, see a lot of Alice in Wonderland parallels in My Neighbour Totoro as well. Obviously, the cat bus, which really looks like the cat from Alice in Wonderland, to the point that Miyazaki literally came out and said, no, this is based on traditional ideas of cats in Japan. I wasn't actually inspired by Alice in Wonderland, which is really interesting because even the way the Totoros are discovered, you see the little girl literally following this white little Totoro into, away from her home and into this magical land. So that there are several little parallels there.
It's funny, I never thought about it, but you're right. There are definitely parallels. And the cat bus definitely has that Cheshire cat grin, even if it's not directly inspired. To jump back on what you said about Takahata, you're right. When I talk about that blend of Japanese and Western, I think I agree that Takahata is much more uniquely Japanese. I think Ghibli has an aesthetic that is very influenced by Miyazaki. I think the other filmmakers have tended to imitate or at least walk in Miyazaki's footsteps. But really, it's not so much a studio with an idea of itself as much as a place where two artists got to do their thing. And so Takahata has been doing his thing while Miyazaki has been doing his.
That's so incredibly true as well. It really shows in the films that Miyazaki and Takahata chose to do after this double feature. where Miyazaki started to work with all of these fantastic worlds, Takahata, with the exception of Pompoko, started to delve into a kind of realism. Instead of making magical worlds feel more natural, more real in the way Miyazaki did, what Takahata did was make reality seem a little bit more magical. If you look, instead of ghosts, spirits, magical monsters, his next film after Grave of the Fireflies was just about memories of a young girl in the 60s and herself as a more adult woman trying to find herself in the 80s, and just this very slow, composed work of self-discovery and humanity, which was obviously a little bit derailed by Pompoko, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about later, and was then followed up by My Neighbors, the Yamadas, which I would argue is one of the best Studio Ghibli films of all time. It just has this completely different style to it. At this point, Takahata doesn't even care about the full extent of his screen. Like, so much of it is just white. He lets these characters live in this, what essentially feels like a child's drawing. And that's how the entire film starts, is this little girl drawing her grandmother, explaining how she's drawing it. And then that's the style of the entire film, which, of course, again, this was from a comic strip in a newspaper, and it's coupling in that same kind of style. But I just love the fact that we're just entering into this childlike world with a childlike animation style. It just captures these very mundane moments. So mundane that when I saw it the first time, I was a bit dismissive. I didn't get fully caught up in it. But rediscovering it and just feeling the power of how different it was and how Takahata managed to bring these tiny moments, like being lost in a shopping mall or discussing what to eat or grades, and turn it into something that large and spectacular. I mean, it truly shows a true artist.
I really love My Neighbors, the Yamadas. Like Chris, I thought the animation style was very striking with all the white space and the watercolors, and the images sort of seamlessly blend into each other. I thought it was an excellent animation style. I thought it really suited it because it's a series of vignettes rather than just, a narrative in there. I would have liked the daughter who got the family lost. Would have liked to have a bit more screen time in there. But I just thought it was just so strikingly done. And if you look at Only Yesterday also, that's also got a couple of different animation styles in there for the present day and for her memories. And it's just really interesting what Takahata does there with the different styles. And that's even more true with Pompoko. With Pompoko, you've got these raccoons, and the raccoons can transform into anything. It's some sort of power they have, I think in Japanese mythology or folklore. I'm not sure the correct term for it. You see the raccoons very realistically, and then you see them extremely cartoon-like, and you also see them in between. And just the way he melds so many animation styles together, it's just such an amazing film to look at. And it's also an incredibly funny film, Pompoko. I mean, you wouldn't think it if you think about Only Yesterday or Grave of the Fireflies, but Pompoko is sort of the Takahata from the Panda Go Panda films. A lot of humor in there, but also a very strong ecological message, which is something which I guess you'd see in a lot of Studio Ghibli films, especially the ones from Miyazaki.
I think what I love about Takahata is his willingness to experiment, and especially in terms of animation style, as you said. My Neighbors, the Yamadas in particular, is a film that is unlike any other Ghibli film, really. Not just in how it looks, but also what it's about, right? This comic strip adaptation, it's very light, it's, as you said, non-narrative, I mean, it's just sketches. It's completely delightful, and I absolutely love it, but it's not, just doesn't look like any other Ghibli film. Even Only Yesterday, it's also different stylistically, right? This kind of watercolor style for the memories, but it's about environmentalism, which is maybe the central theme of almost all Ghibli films. I mean, it's almost always present, except maybe in the Yamadas. And Pompoko is the most overtly political film about that. I didn't think of Pompoko as being that different stylistically. I think you're right with the transformations, but I think it generally looks more like a Miyazaki film than something like Only Yesterday to me.
Yeah, I agree. And that's also why it's so different in Takahata's filmography as well, especially his filmography at Studio Ghibli, because he was always working in a way in a contrast to Miyazaki, a bit like his the yin to his yang, because from the very beginning to the very end, he presented such a stylistic difference with completely different focuses and choices. And with Pompoko, you just have that kind of childlike wonder again, the kind of things you so often associate with Miyazaki, even though there's one thing I really can't get over in Pompoko, and that is, the source of their magical powers, which is, and it's even odd that we can say this on air, that this is a children's film, but the things that these raccoons do with their testicles and scrotums, that's one of the things that also makes the film seem a little bit childish and juvenile to me, at least the first time I saw it, and I haven't actually gone back to it since. It's just the fact that, they're flying with their literal scrotums, and they're jumping on their testicles, and this is so odd to see.
I had heard about that way before seeing the film, so I was kind of ready for it. But when you watch the film, it's actually it comes up very naturally. I think 3/4 of the way to the film, because it's not at the very start. Yeah, when you describe it, it sounds completely insane. And the film is kind of insane, but maybe not as much as it sounds.
I'd say that, if you're prepared for it, it's not that insane. Because, I think all the top comments on Letterboxd for Pompoko are about the testicles. But,
Yes.
once you get over that or whatever, and once you're expecting it, it's nothing, really. It's part of the film.
Fair enough. I really should rewatch it, because it came completely unexpected, and I really couldn't believe what I was watching there.
And just to add to the point about contrasting, it's funny, by the way, that My Neighbors the Yamadas, which is probably the lightest, most overtly comedic film in all of his filmography, came just after Miyazaki made his darkest film in Mononoke, contrasting all the way.
I think also this contrasting of styles in Takahata's work you mentioned worked really wonderful in My Neighbors Yamada, because one thing I noticed, and the one thing I really loved about it, is that the amount of details increases and decreases based on the focus that Takahata wants us to see, or the emotions he wants us to feel. So more fleeting moments, like someone just going off to work or school, essentially anything but a fence and some flowers maybe just be completely white. It's just not drawn in at all. While in more realistic scenes, like when the girl gets lost, you see a much larger scope of the shopping mall and the streets, etc. And this, of course, leads into one of the most dramatic climaxes as well, which is a moment of quite a lot of fear in the father, where he goes to confront some young hooligans, essentially. And the animation style just completely changes. Gone are the more childlike animations. The streets completely detailed. The watercolors are so much darker. It's just a completely different vision that just keeps going in that scene. Everything looks so different, so much bleaker, until something happens that's a bit more comical and the style starts to change again. But it's just so interesting that Takahata uses different animated styles in the same film to really get our emotions engaged and set the mood, and it just works so incredibly well.
Yeah, he gets out of that scene by basically doing a superhero parody, which goes back to that style. And also in Only Yesterday, he uses that kind of watercolor, less clear style for memories, which obviously makes sense because memories are fuzzy. He's really willing to use form to serve the content, which Miyazaki, it's not that he always does the same thing. I think he does quite different things. You have something completely epic like Mononoke as opposed to something very intimate like Totoro. So I think he has quite a range as well, but not as much in terms of form. Right? His films always look in a certain style, which is gorgeous, but always similar.
Yeah, that's really, really true. If you look at any of his films, from Nausicaa and on, they really look and feel almost the same, even with all of the technical changes. And Studio Ghibli did go into digital developments as well with Yamada's and Spirited Away. But the visual style really stayed the same, and you can really feel when it is a Miyazaki film. Or actually, maybe not. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but if you look at a lot of the, if you don't mind the crass words, imposters, or the people trying to pick up the mantle after him in Studio Ghibli, you also feel the same thing. If you look at Ariete, for instance, you can kind of feel that, they're really trying to still utilize the Miyazaki style. But it's just so interesting that they just kept the same visual style while developing different themes. Like you mentioned, Princess Mononoke really gets violent. And he also have films that bordered much more on realism. Oddly enough, I don't think he ever did a completely normal, if you will, drama until The Wind Rises, which we'll discuss at the very end. But he did make films like My Neighbour Totoro, which were a lot closer to life, and also his next film after that, which was Porco Rosso, which he has to protect as a literal pig who's also a pilot. But you can essentially feel, both with the animation style and just the scope of the plot, that had you made him into a regular human being and had it be a more normal human drama like The Wind Rises, it would still have worked. So he does have these more toned down, more realistic stories as well in him, but he would of course always choose to lean on the more magical.
I'm not sure I would call Porco Rosso toned down, but it's true that there's a big difference in that it's homage to old Hollywood films. I mean, that's something that you don't see in any other Miyazaki film, but it's clearly the idea of Porco Rosso, right? You have this noir, essentially. Well, not really a noir, but there's kind of elements of that with the bar and with the romance that's kind of unfulfilled between the protagonists. It is different. I don't think I would necessarily talk about it as being that much more realistic.
I would agree that Takahata has definitely varied his style quite a bit throughout his filmography, whereas Miyazaki's pretty much stayed the same. And I also agree that a lot of people have tried to imitate the Miyazaki style, no doubt due to the success and also the brilliance of Spirited Away. And I guess a lot of films feel like they're trying to tap into that whole magical worlds thing again, which might lead us into some of the other directors who's worked for Studio Ghibli. You can think about films like Ariete, based on The Borrowers, or films like The Cat Returns.
Yeah, let's talk about those imposters, which I think, for their defense, one of them is literally named Miyazaki, so I think he has a right to.
Well, yes, the lesser Miyazaki. Without anyone mentioning anything, and I haven't heard any buzz of it at all, the lesser Miyazaki, Goro Miyazaki, will actually be releasing a film this year from Studio Ghibli. And again, I haven't heard a single thing about it. We're almost at the end of the year. I think it's coming out in December. And yeah, no buzz, no words.
I think it's quite revealing that Goro Miyazaki's first film, Tales from Earthsea or of Earthsea, it starts with a young, depressed kid killing his father, who is this very wise, old ruler. I think there's something that, when it started like that, I was very, very hopeful and then kind of disappointed.
Yeah, From Earthsea was a big disappointment. I went into it knowing there was meant to be Studio Ghibli's worst film or weakest rated one on IMDb. Even expecting it to not be that good, I found it extremely subpar and still managed to disappoint me. And it's not so much that the narrative isn't that interesting, and, well, it isn't really that interesting. The villain is, it's a pretty average megalomaniac, formulaic motivations. The animation was actually extremely disappointing for me. The film's set in 2 or 3 locations. It's not really the big worlds we're used to seeing in Studio Ghibli. And a lot of backgrounds are actually pretty static, like they're unmoving backgrounds. And I guess you don't see that in all of the Studio Ghibli films. There's definitely a lot of them. Things are constantly moving in the background. Things are going on. Whereas a lot of it seemed really flat and Earthsea. So that really disappointed me from an animation style and a story point of view. But I probably disliked From Up on Poppy Hill more, which was Goro's film they did 5 years after that. And that one over there, I actually didn't mind the animation. I actually thought the animation was good. I thought the music was good. The story, though, was just, there was nothing to it. Helping to save a clubhouse while falling in love with a shy classmate. I mean, there was a bit of conflict in there. I mean, she starts to wonder if she can be related to a new crush, but the mystery of it's never that enticing. The fixing up of the clubhouse was like an 80s comedy subplot. There was even a montage sequence in there, which is just like one of those fixing up comedy montages. And I don't know. By the end of it, I was just like, I can't believe this is a Studio Ghibli film. It feels nothing like it in any way. Other than the fact that I did actually like the animation in that one compared to Earthsea.
I mean, I think the animation is really what saves From Up Poppy Hill. I mean, really great to look at. And I also thought it was a brave choice, because we have his father making all of these great big magical worlds, and here he is making this little story from the 1960s. And I think this is something that we could theoretically have seen Takahata delve into as well. He's also brought forth these very normal stories from days past, including the 60s, and given them a lot of visual poetry and beauty and elevated them. I mean, there's nothing overtly incredible about the stories from Only Yesterday and My Neighbor is the Yamadas. It's really just the way he's presenting these little things and the way he's elevating these things. And that's just not something that Guru was able to do. It's not structured in an interesting way. It's not really elevating what is happening there with the animation style. It looks great. It's a perfectly pleasant film. It just doesn't have anything extra to offer. There's nothing else under the hood. And I think that really is greatest weakness, really. He really just doesn't know how to bring that magic to his work.
Yeah, I think pleasant is the exact word I would use to describe that film. I enjoyed it. I don't think the story is that bad, but it's not that interesting either. And it looks really good. And yeah, there's not that much more to say about it. It's interesting in the sense that it's kind of Goro Miyazaki saying, all right, I'll just do something in the style of my father, fine. But aside from that, it's not super interesting. I'm a little more interested in the films of Hiromasa Yonebayashi, who did Arrietty and When Marnie Was There. And I actually think the latter, When Marnie Was There, is my favorite non-Miyazaki, non-Takahata film that Ghibli has done. It's different. It's more of a drama. Actually, of all the Ghibli films, I think it's the one that blends the Western material, because it's adapted from a British book, I believe, with a Japanese setting the best. I think even better than Howl's Moving Castle, which I think is Miyazaki's weakest film. And it also is this coming-of-age story, which we see in a lot of Ghibli films, but it does feel different, more internal. There's no obvious adventure. And there's something else about it, which I think is something new for Ghibli, which is there's a bit of a hint of homosexual relationship, maybe, or awakening. I mean, it's a little muddled by the whole story, which is a little complicated. But I think there was something in When Marnie Was There that could have been promising for Ghibli, that could have been something new. And in the end, they kind of missed out on it because Yonebayashi is now working for his own studio. I think it's kind of a testament of how Ghibli ends up just being Miyazaki and Takahata. And once Miyazaki is gone, I think Ghibli will be done.
It's interesting to hear you discuss When Marnie Was There and praise it quite heavily, because I didn't like it that much. I agree about the homosexuality, although I actually thought it was quite pronounced. I thought it was just the way they kept saying how much they love each other, the way they were embracing. I thought it pretty much made it to be a lesbian love story, which I thought, oh, okay, this is pretty cool. This is very out there and very different for Studio Ghibli. But then the way that it twists the story around with this complex mythology, which I don't think I can really reveal without spoiling the film too much. But yeah, it basically doesn't make a lot of sense, and it raises a lot more questions than it answers, and it actually gives everything a bit of a creepy vibe. So I thought the animation was absolutely beautiful in When Marnie Was There. Just some striking colors for the skies and the characters framed against there. And there's one shot which is like Leo on Titanic, which is just excellently done. The animation was beautiful, but the story really got to me. And the more I think about it, the more I didn't particularly like it.
I agree that it's a bit muddled, but I think it works in the sense that she's also a creative person, right? The main character. And so to me, I interpret it as being mostly fictional, but I agree that the film is a little muddled in that respect.
Yeah, muddled was the exact word I would have used. I think it was a film with a lot of early promise, and it has a lot of beauty, but at least for me, that the story and the twist, etc., it just muddled everything up so much that it was a bit of a middling disappointment. And it was essentially the film that kind of killed off Studio Ghibli's attempt at raising other directors as well. Like after that point, it was really just the end with Takahata and Miyazaki's final films, and then this just long lull. Though if we're talking about Yonebayashi, I do actually think Arrietty was his superior film, because while I didn't love it, the only film I have loved from Studio Ghibli that is not Miyazaki and Takahata is Whisper from the Heart. But out of the later films, I think Arrietty is the one that really manages to capture just this wonder, and especially in the animation, you just have these smaller moments when Arrietty is just climbing or stepping out on a little bit of puddle of water, for instance. You really just feel the beauty in the animation right there. So that's the film of the later Studio Ghibli film that was not directed by Miyazaki Takahata that stood out to me.
Arrietty is definitely an interesting film because it's got a lot of the Ghibli magic in there, just with the source material there. And yeah, just some interesting ways that she copes with the giant world around her. Like bugs are as large as pets and she can make them into bouncy balls. What I didn't like about Arrietty, which is very different from a lot of Miyazaki films at least, is that there actually is an evil antagonist in there. So the boy's caregiver or housekeeper or whatever, he's like this evil character who wants to exterminate the borrowers or whatever they're called in the film. And I didn't like that aspect of it because what I liked about a lot of other Studio Ghibli films is that nobody in there is completely evil or just maybe misguided in a way.
I definitely agree on that point. I think it's a weak point in Arrietty. Just to respond to Chris a bit, I like Whisper of the Heart and I like Arrietty. I think they're both lovely films, but they do feel derivative to me of Miyazaki's style specifically. Even though there are differences, I think Whisper of the Heart specifically, there's some great sequences, like when she follows the cat, right, at the start of the film. But, later you have the fantasy sequence with the statuette, and that kind of feels like an obligatory insertion to fit into the Ghibli canon to me. And I think When Man Was There, even though I agree it's imperfect, for me it works emotionally. I think what it brings is that it does feel different. And you said it was the end of Ghibli trying to nurse new filmmakers, right? And I think they never really tried, actually. And I think there's an example of that with Mamoru Hosoda, the guy who then directed Wolf Children and Mirai and stuff like that. He was actually rejected from Ghibli. And I think you look at his films and they really feel like what Ghibli could have been in the 21st century, right after Miyazaki and Takahata. So I think they just never really intended to let anyone else do their thing, really.
I might just jump in there on a couple of things. So, Whisper of the Heart, yeah, I agree with the fantasy stuff. Following the Cat was really excellent. It was probably my favorite part of the film. But overall, I probably prefer The Cat Returns, which came out, I think, 7 years later, which is sort of a bit of a spin-off of Whisper from the Heart. It's a bit of a variation of Alice in Wonderland, following the cat around. I thought that was really good. And I also do agree that Wolf Children is an amazing film. And it does seem a shame that Studio Ghibli wouldn't take on a director who could produce something as magical and wondrous and really affecting as a coming-of-age tale as Wolf Children is.
Well, no, I want to see The Cat Returns. It's one of the two with Ocean Waves I haven't seen.
I think Ocean Waves is the one that most people just haven't seen. It's actually one of the few other Studio Ghibli films that don't delve into magic. It's just this very small little drama story that's perfectly delightful but doesn't really do much else. I would absolutely recommend it for anyone who loves Studio Ghibli. Get that in there because it's nice to have it. But it was also the first film, and until Kuro's film this year, only TV film. So it's just this much, much smaller work.
Interesting to hear. I have got Ocean Waves unwatched on DVD, as I've talked before in previous podcasts. I've got a large range of unwatched DVDs. Films on no official list on iCheck Movies, which has probably helped to become a low priority, but I'm sure I'll get around to Ocean Waves eventually.
Yeah, it is very sad that Studio Ghibli really did try to develop directors and make Studio Ghibli something that would last. I guess Miyazaki, I think the only one that could have had a shot would have been Yoshifumi Kondo, who was the director of Whisper Art, who at the time was seen and believed to be the heir apparent, but he died before he could even make his second film. And a lot of people even blamed Takahata for essentially driving him to his death with all of the extreme requirements that Studio Ghibli had at the time. And we all know that animation studios have very intense work practices. So it's just so sad. I've never really saw any other great artists develop, even though Yonebayashi, now with Studio Ponok, may be able to bring some of that magic to life. But diving into what was originally seen as the swan song of Studio Ghibli, the finale, the two great minds of Studio Ghibli once again joining up for a double feature. And slightly odd and tragic thing here being that in 2013, it was 14 years since Takahata's previous film. My Neighbor Yamada from 1999 had for such a long time been his last film. He had been working on The Tale of Princess Kaguya for 8 years at this point, just really struggling through this process. And it ended up becoming this race where they wanted to release them at the very same time. But Takahata, despite having much bigger head start from Miyazaki, just couldn't finish it at the same time. And it was slightly later in 2013. But still, this swan song was as beautiful and poetic and once again contrasting as you might imagine. And interestingly, once again, the roles flipped, with Miyazaki creating his first, as I said earlier, more ordinary drama. Of course, it's not ordinary. There's absolutely fantastic dream sequences in there. But this is an actual biography of a real human being. No elements of overt magic. And we are set in a period from World War I till the end of World War II. Meanwhile, Takahata went back into mythology and created this beautiful old story of a princess coming down from the sky, or from the moon to be specific, discovered by a bamboo cutter, and just these little beautiful magical moments as she grows up into a princess and is forced into situations she's just not comfortable with. And here again, the style is completely different from anything we have seen from Takahata. It almost looks more like the kind of minimalistic French animation you see sometimes. It's just beautiful. Such a wonderful attention to detail. Just tying in one small scene to prove this. And what some of you might not know is that Takahata really hated one of the pivotal scenes in Grave of the Fireflies, where the young boy cuts open a melon. He just didn't think it looked realistic enough. He didn't think it sliced correctly enough. So in a scene in The Tale of Princess Kaguya, where a young boy cuts open a melon, he actually would bring this fruit into the studio with several knives and have the animator practice and practice and practice to get this right, which just seems ridiculous given just how minimalistic and how light the animation is here. But he still wanted that cut to feel real, which made it also again just showcase why this film took 8 years to produce. So let's dive right into these two films, and I know this will get a little bit contentious. So what were your first reactions to seeing these two films?
So, The Tale of Princess Kaguya, I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly. I really loved Takahata's animation style there. I thought the hand-drawn frames were incredibly effective. There's especially a sequence where she goes for a nighttime run, all the lines around her burst really together. As a story itself, though, I thought it had a few weaknesses in there. There are a few things that didn't quite add up to me. Some things about the parents having the wealth to move to the city, or the suitors returning within a week of each other after being away for 3 years. However, it is very well done as an animated film. It is beautiful to look at, but it's probably my least favorite Takahata film. I mean, I've given all of his films 7 out of 10 or more on IMDb, so I do like them all, but this is probably my least favorite one. So as a final film for Studio Ghibli, or one of the final films, together with When Marnie Was There, which I also didn't love, bit of a weekend for me, but I do agree the animation style is incredibly effective. With The Wind Rises, I do have to object to what Chris has said, so yeah, it is going to get controversial. I think there is overt magic in The Wind Rises, and I actually think it's the number one most interesting aspect of the film, because the film begins with him having a surreal dream in which he interacts with an Italian plane engineer, and the plane engineer insists that he is the one who's dreaming. So I know maybe it's not overt magic, fine, but it is a little bit of fantasy, maybe like that the Italian engineer might be having this dream that he's sharing with the Japanese engineer. I don't know, but I just thought that was the best part of the film. And the Italian guy pops up a little bit later at a few points and he mentors the protagonist. And I absolutely love those scenes. The rest of the film, most sadly, didn't do much for me. And I love Miyazaki when he gets into the magic, when he gets into the fantasy. And the dream sequences, the fantasy sequences, I absolutely love them. But the drama stuff, there's some romantic melodrama. There's some social misfit moments. There's some debating about design and killing machines. But nothing was ever as interesting for me as this guy is having these dreams about this engineer who's mentoring along the way, and I would have loved that to be the focus of the film rather than all the romantic melodrama stuff, and also some stuff with wife, which, from what I've read, actually isn't true to the person who the film was based on, which maybe shouldn't play into my estimation of it. But yeah, just everything put all together, it was a disappointment for me. The Wind Rises is probably, I don't know, it's definitely bottom 3, but it's probably my least favorite Miyazaki film. It's definitely a bottom 3 for me. And with that one, and with Princess Kaguya being my least favorite Takahata, and when Marnie was there doing my head in, that's where I sort of get that argument that Studio Ghibli sort of faded in my estimation towards the end of their time in the spotlight.
So it's an interesting double feature because it's not really a double feature. They were supposed to come together because it was, I guess, an occasion, and it ended up not working out. I suggest anyone interested in this seeing The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, which is a documentary made around that time when they were both supposed to be released. And when you see kind of the working environment at Ghibli with Miyazaki being this really strict taskmaster and Takahata being off-screen doing things, kind of being out of control. I mean, he's not really much in the film, but it's kind of interesting to get a sense of both directors' personalities there. I don't think the films have that much to do with each other, but I personally love Kaguya. It's actually my favorite Takahata, just ahead of Grave of the Fireflies. Part of it, of course, is the style. It is unbelievably beautiful. The scene you mentioned, Saul, when she runs away from the city and when all of the as you said, the lights become lines, I think that's just great. That's just amazing. And I found the film very, very touching, very emotionally. All Takahata films basically made me cry, which I don't cry much at movies. I think Takahata has something special there. And yeah, Kaguya, I see it also, and I'm not sure this is really what was intended, but I see it also kind of as a criticism of Buddhism and of this idea of disconnecting yourself from the world. And at the end, she's, I guess, spoilers for Kaguya. And at the end, she's, taken back to the moon because it's a very sad film in that sense. Right? It's a story of a failure. It's a fairy tale, but not with a fairy tale ending, or maybe with a classic fairy tale ending. And regarding the Wind Rises, that's an interesting point you make, Saul. I admit I did not think of it at all as fantasy. To me, it just is a biopic with dream sequences, which happens all the time, and it's not necessarily considered fantasy. I think it's an interesting point you make with both of the characters having the dream at the same time. Maybe that's kind of a fantastical element, but it did not really feel to me that way. The Wind Rises is not one of my favorites Miyazaki's, but I think it's a fascinating film because it's obviously very personal. One of the things we haven't talked about is with the name Ghibli, it comes from a plane, right? An Italian plane, because Miyazaki was fascinated with planes when he was a kid, and certainly his fascination with flying shows up in all of his films, basically. And even in some other Ghibli films. I mean, Kaguya has a pretty prominent flying scene. And yeah, The Wind Rises is really interesting in that it's so personal for him. I think it's him trying to reckon with his love for this man who was designing the Zero airplane, right? This very famous airplane from World War II. And Miyazaki is a pacifist. That's another theme we haven't talked about that much, but it's also present in his films, like especially House Moving Castle and Castle in the Sky. And this is him kind of trying to reconcile both of those things. And I think that's both a strength and a weakness of the film. A strength because it's just a very interesting thing. I think the whole scene where the main character goes to this retreat and has this conversation, which actually, to your point, Saul, kind of feels fantastical. It kind of feels like he's going to some sort of a magical land to talk with a ghost or something like that. I think this whole scene is great, but I think in the end, the film feels a little like trying to apologize for it. I mean, the central quote of the film, right? The Paul Valéry quote, "The wind rises and we must try to live." It's kind of oh, well, the world is difficult. You do what you can. I think there's a bit of a weak resolution there, but it is a gorgeous film. Also, I think the earthquake sequence is particularly notable in terms of animation. So to me, it's not a disappointment. It's not my favorite Miyazaki film by any stretch. It's not even close, but it is a film I find at least very interesting and quite beautiful and generally really like, even though I have some fun.
I will give Saul my agreement of 1 point. Dream sequences do add in a lot of the magic and beauty and wonder that Studio Ghibli is known for. But to me, as with Mathieu, these were really just dream sequences. Even though they do play around with this idea that both men could be dreaming at the same time, they do add in this really magical connection and these dreams from the very beginning. That it's just about this passion of flight, this passion of flying, something that we've seen in Miyazaki's work from the very beginning. I mean, this man just loves aircrafts. You can feel it all the way back to Nausicaa. And I rewatched Castle in the Sky just a few days ago. It opens up in the air and just immediately you believe it because of the soundscape, which is one of the things that we haven't talked about here. Just the soundscape of so many of Miyazaki's films are so immersive, so real. And he really focuses in on how each and every single form of aircraft sounds. And this time completely back to The Wind Rises, where you see the experimentation with the flights and you see them testing out different planes. You can really feel how they drive and how they flow, and it blends into this narrative of magic and wonder. It's really like Miyazaki wants you to feel the same wonder that he feels about planes, and that in the very real character of Jiro Hirokoshi, he tries to channel the same kind of wonder he has for aircrafts into Jiro Horikoshi. This ties in with what Mathieu said as well about just the reflection of the film, how it portrays Horikoshi, because throughout this film, it's very clear he is not interested in war. He laments the fact that these planes have to have weapons in them. It makes it clear time and time again he would prefer planes to be for transport and pleasure. And in the Dreams with Caproni, the Italian engineer, you can see that this is the dream both of them have. But in a very pivotal early scene, which is set in the dream during the end of World War I, Caproni tells him a story, which is essentially the moral of the story in a way, where Caproni asks him, would you rather live in a world with pyramids or without them? And essentially saying that even though planes can so much mayhem and destruction, it would be horrible to live in a world without planes. So it's really just this wonder, no matter what they may do. And it's just this driving force that he seems completely oblivious and uncaring about what he's taking part of. Even to the point that, and without spoiling anything, there is one scene closer to the end where he laments the fact that, you know, his planes that went out to war were so beautiful, but none of them came back. And he can say that because it's a real story. But that's the lamentation. Like, that's what he's sad about. The fact that they didn't come back. He's not sad about what these planes actually did. And I think this is one of the things that Miyazaki, as a pacifist, trying to show Horikoshi in such a great light and trying to show his passion, also stumbled upon something that is quite interesting.
It is definitely an interesting dynamic which the film brings up, in that would it be better to have a world without planes at all? I don't know if I have that much of an opinion on it, because I don't necessarily conform to traditional values in terms of morality, but definitely on Letterboxd there were some very heated discussions and very heated reviews about this point, and saying, oh, well, the guy just doesn't care, he just wants to build the planes anyway, and if they have to be used for war, fine, they have to be used for war, at least he gets to build his planes. So I can understand why some people see a bit of a mixed message in there. I didn't really mind it that much. I guess from my point of view, I just found all of the romantic melodrama and being a social misfit and everything just really dull for me compared to the dream sequences.
One thing I want to mention about that is the main performance. I mean, I'm assuming we're all watching these films subbed. And the guy who does the voice acting for the main character in The Wind Rises is Hideaki Anno, who's better known as the creator of Evangelion, and who actually worked for Miyazaki when he was young. I think he worked on Nausicaa. And he has this he's clearly not an actor. Let's just say that. I think his performance works, but it's very dispassionate, very monotone. And I think it kind of gives this impression that this is a man who's very disconnected from the world. And so he sees his planes as being this work of art, this his reason for existing. I think that's also something that Miyazaki relates to very strongly in this character. All of Miyazaki's films are all about finding yourself through work, through, what you can do in life. Even you look at Spirited Away, what really makes her grow as a character is working in the bathhouse. And I think that's also that element that's there and that interacts with this performance that is very dispassionate. I think it is a morally complex film. I don't think it's irreproachable. Certainly, I think there are definitely things to criticize, but it is engaging with those ideas, which is what I think makes it a valuable film.
No, I completely agree with that. It's very true that is the choice that Miyazaki made when he brought this character to life, that this is just someone who is that displaced from the current situation, just loves planes so much, and really doesn't seem to completely grasp the full world around him. He's always working, he's always striving for this passion, even as, his wife is very sick. There's a scene where he's in great emotional turmoil, he's on a train to see her, and you can still see him working, with tears dripping down on his paper. It's a very interesting portrayal. It's a very human portrayal, and I think the first time I saw this film, it actually became instantly my favorite Miyazaki. It's not anymore, but the first time I saw it, I really got caught up in these personal elements of the story. I think they work so very well, even though that romance and that character and his own limitations, it did become a very emotionally charged film, which does make it a very interesting film in contrast to Princess Kaguya, because here the realism is far more stripped back. If you can talk about The Wind Rises as one of Miyazaki's most realistic and most heartfelt films, I'm not sure if all of you would agree with that, but I do think that is one of his main aims with the film, at least. Princess Kaguya feels far closer to poetry and beauty, and that's just not just the style. From a story perspective, it's quite odd, for instance, that all of the suitors will all come back within a couple of weeks of each other after 3 years. That's also one of the more traditional fairy tale elements that's tied into here, because it is in so many ways, a fairy tale, a moral tale, this form of poetry that's supposed to say and mean a lot more. And before I set the conversation over to you, I really wanted to go back to what you guys mentioned previously, with the scene where she runs away and the animation style completely changes. It becomes more hectic. It essentially becomes sketches. It's just rough print, from this beautiful soft animation to rougher and rougher and rougher prints with these black lines being drawn as if in charcoal. I thought it was such a wonderful contrast with the Yamadas, because in the Yamadas you see Takahata turn to a more realistic animation style when he tries to make us feel emotional, where this simple childlike style just becomes this far more powerful, far more realistic, dark scene in a moment of personal turmoil. In Princess Kaguya, it's the exact opposite, but he also manages to succeed at the same thing. Let us feel emotional turmoil by changing the style, but this time in the completely opposite direction, and just turning it into these bare-boned emotions, and you can really feel these emotions with those charcoal strokes. So it's just really impressive the way he can just once again grip our emotions by just completely changing the way he animates his films.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I think I agree with what you said about that scene. One thing I would point out between those two films is they're both really about characters who feel displaced in the world. Kaguya literally is not from this world. And as we said, Jiro is kind of disconnected because he is this artist who doesn't want to engage with the realities of the early 20th century. So I think that's another point between them, even though, yes, they are very different in that one is a fairy tale and the other is literally a biopic.
And I do think that with Kaguya, there's interesting dynamic and messaging where you have this princess coming from the moon and being raised by these poor farmers, and then she just gets all of this excess from the moon. The bamboo cutter just keeps finding treasures such as money, beautiful linings, and he decides to change her life and to take this girl growing up in nature and grow up free and taking her to the big city and giving her all of this luxury in this hope and belief of making her happy, talking about this greatest happiness, the greatest happiness being not being able to live, essentially. She's instantly trained into being a lady who's not even allowed to stand on her own 2 feet. She's literally forced to sit down. She's literally forced to do all of these activities that she does not enjoy at all. All the time, the father just keeps going on about this wonderful happiness. The greatest happiness is getting married. The greatest happiness is this and this and this. And you could see and feel her heart breaking because it just goes against her entire being and everything she wants to do. You really just have this contrast once again of nature and freedom and humanity versus all of these stilted customs. And it's just such a wonderful parable in so many ways. And I think with the animation style, with the choices he did, and just a beautiful finale as well, it really is in the running for one of Takahata's best work.
Yeah, it really feels to me like a Buddhist tragedy because, as you said, she's born in nature and society, which has these ideas that are influenced by Buddhism, and that's how she is essentially training to be a lady, right? This whole idea of being as unemotional as possible, that is religiously significant. And maybe you can see Takahata's point as being that it's completely missing the point, right? That what she's actually meant to be is to be free. The whole point of that religion is to free yourself from the world. And I think that's where it's a little bit of a criticism of that religion as well, because of that philosophy. Because in the end, what the film wants clearly for her is to go back to a certain sense of nature, not to be disconnected from the world. And that's what happens to her at the end. So it's kind of a criticism of both ideas, right? The idea of materialism, essentially, as you said, all the things that are brought by this magical thing happening at the start, but also a criticism of wanting to completely disconnect from the world to avoid suffering and desires. At least that's how I read it.
And with this swansongs, Studio Ghibli was meant to more or less be done. They were going to keep open the museum. They did provide work on the Red Turtle, in which it was actually Takahata that was involved as a producer. And you can see some similarities to his work. But this was essentially the end, until it wasn't, without anyone actually caring, which is quite sad. Goro Miyazaki is releasing Earwig and the Witch. There's still a little bit of a future, but do you think there is a future after Miyazaki is gone? And do you think these will be the final films from Studio Ghibli?
Sadly, I just don't. I think they missed the boat on some younger talents and they just chose to remain the Miyazaki and Takahata studio. I'm really looking forward to Miyazaki's most likely final film, but I think Ghibli will live on only in the form of the museum, which is great, and stuff like that. But, we all often think of it as being the Japanese Disney, but I think it just was never that. It was only the studio for these two great artists, and that's all it's ever going to be.
I think we might see a revival of Studio Ghibli in the future. Studios like Hammer, the British studio which made all those horror films in the 50s and 60s, they've gone through a couple of revivals. There might be a revival, but it wouldn't be quite the same. It is quite interesting with Miyazaki that he keeps saying that each film will be his last film, so who knows if the next one will be, but he's not the only director who's gone down that pathway. I mean, Steven Soderbergh instantly springs to mind. He said that Side Effects was going to be his last film and it was going to only work in television because he hated the film process, but he's made a number of feature films since Side Effects. And Loach has come out of retirement to do I, Daniel Blake, and then to carry on and do Sorry We Missed You. Even horror directors like Herschel Gordon Lewis just come back. 20 or 30 years later and started doing more horror films. So I think if, Miyazaki continues to live, I think he'll continue to make films. He might continue to say they're his last, but I'm sure he'll continue making them until it's his time.
Miyazaki is turning 80, but we have, of course, seen directors their 90s, even some working into their hundreds. So it is absolutely possible that Miyazaki will make another film after this. I did look a little bit into his next film, which is called How Do You Live? And I think it's interesting that the film's description is simply the film depicts the psychological growth of a teenage boy through interactions with his friends and uncle. And that the animation style, at least on the cover and on some of the screenshots I could find, actually looks quite a bit like Takahata's work. So you have white edges. I'm not sure if that's how it will actually look in the end, but it does seem like another fitting song in a way. Like it would really be a wonderful goodbye, but obviously it's far too early in the process to be sure of what it will be.
Yeah, just to add on Miyazaki's retirement, I don't think he will ever willfully retire. I think his first retirement was actually when Kondo died, so that was after Mononoke, so over 20 years ago. I don't think he will ever willfully retire, but he is getting old, and I think, he probably won't make that many more films. I would expect 2 at the most, because it takes some time. Yeah, I don't believe in his retirement any more than in the ones of all those people you mentioned, so I just think we just won't get that many more films from him.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think you're completely right there, Mathieu. So let's hope he can finish this one. Perhaps there will be even more to come. And as Sol mentioned, you never know with Studio Ghibli. Like, there's so many great directors working in Japan right now in anime, and if Studio Ghibli was smart, they could easily hook one of those talents in and stay alive. But it's really hard to speculate. It's really hard to know where they will go in the future. It's just with such an iconic brand which has brought us so many beautiful films, even though essentially any film not made by Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata just weren't that great. It'll be sad to see them go. And with that said, I think we will have to say goodbye to this episode. It was wonderful talking about Studio Ghibli with both of you today, rewatching several of the films leading up to this episode and just discovering a lot of the magic that Studio Ghibli has to offer. There's just so many wonderful worlds, so many wonderful styles, and the contrast between Miyazaki and Takahata is just, I would say, perfect. They complete each other in so many incredible ways. And with that said, thank you so much for listening, and please join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.